book now. We have we're finishing like one section, which is the battles, and now kind of we're going to be turning our attention to the settling down of the land. And so you're going to see, we're going to read chapter 12, which is kind of like a summation list of where they went, who they beat, etc. And then we're going to go into this new kind of like a summation list. Oh, there we go. We're on. We're going to go to then kind of have the settling of the land. So it's not going to be as upsetting of a in the sense that we're not going to see complete destruction of people. As we mentioned before, there is no historical evidence. Well, I shouldn't say no historical evidence. We don't have much archaeological evidence that there were cities besides a couple like Hatzor where there was violence, or there was a war or battles. And as a matter of fact, as we said, the evidence from Jericho and Ai is that there were cities that were destroyed a long time ago, long before the Israelites came in. And as we didn't really talk that much about it, but another important historical, resource we have now is the DNA. And the DNA actually tells us that most Jews are actually walking around with a whole lot of, if there was a separate Canaanite community, we are also Canaanite. And how do we know that? I mean, we take our DNA, and then we've also studied human remains that we found from that period and done DNA tests on those. And we found, similarities between those communities. So I want to make it real clear. There's a lot of what the DNA tests that we've done on people and on communities has actually told us that a lot of what is in the Bible is actually true. The archaeology doesn't confirm it, but the DNA does. And let me explain that. But for example, the Samaritans who live in northern Israel, and there's a very small community now. Hold it one second. There's a Samaritan community that still exists that is very, very interesting to study from the DNA standpoint, because they're almost completely endogamous. They only marry within themselves. And their DNA tells us that they're our relation, which is what they believe. They say they're descendants of Joshua, of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. But the Bible says that they're descendants of peoples that were moved in by the Assyrians. After the Assyrian destruction of northern Israel, the Assyrians moved in other peoples from other parts of the world. Well,
I was looking at the Assyrians, the Basque reliefs, and they did flaying and they did torture and bragged about it. It makes Joshua looks pretty tame.
Yes. And so Joshua's stories were based on something. They're based on the fact that other cultures too talk about cherem. They actually, Canaanite texts talk about going to battle against people and utterly destroying them. Babylonian and Assyrian texts from around the same time say the same thing. But what's interesting is that the DNA actually tells us that the story is not quite as cut and dry, and that we really have to understand that the mixture of Canaanite and Israelite, or the fact that Canaanites or Israelites are a type of Canaanite is there, and it's there solidly in the DNA. That doesn't mean that the stories aren't true, in the sense that maybe there were some Israelites that came out of Egypt that had lived in Egypt. Maybe Abraham did come from the east, from what would be the Assyrian and Babylonian communities. Maybe he did come from that place. There's an ancestor who lived there and then came and settled in the land. But the overwhelming evidence is that is that we were in this area for a really long time, and um, and interestingly, both the Samaritan DNA tells us that they do go back to Joshua, but that there also were people who settled in the area of the north that also married in with the Assyrian conquest. So both sides of the story are kind of confirmed by the DNA. So it's just a question of like extremes and how the stories, kind of have been, what was the purpose of propagandizing certain aspects of this. And for the Judeans who lived in the southern kingdom, and the remnants of the Jewish people, if you will, who didn't get captured by the Assyrians or taken into exile, or who survived the Babylonian destructions, their purpose of saying the Samaritans weren't legitimate Jews was to essentially say, look, they have no right to live here. It should all be our country. And so there was a reason for saying it from the standpoint of propaganda and politics, but the DNA tells a different story, which really shouldn't be surprising, that the majority, or at least their Samaritans, were accurate in saying that they were people who constantly lived in the north, who never got exiled, who never got taken away by the Assyrians. So those lost tribes, there might have been parts of the tribes that were lost, but it's also possible, or not possible, but highly probable, that a lot of those tribes never got, Dan, Naphtali, these other tribes that we're going to read about, never really got completely wiped out or taken away. So just kind of keep that in mind, as we read these stories. There does seem to be evidence for when the Bible talks about the Philistines coming from Greece, from the Aegean, that's what the DNA says. That's what the Egyptians say. That's what, like, the evidence is there. So in most cases, we can't just dismiss the Bible narrative and say, well, this was somebody's imagination. It's more likely that in some cases the stories are embellished or exaggerated, but they're not completely, made up. And that's the way I kind of remind people to look at this. Do we read Joshua for history? No, but there are kernels of the story that are interesting, and but again, to use it as a justification for anything that we do now, or for that God wants us to do this, you got to be very careful, because number one, by our modern sensibilities, there's no way you can say that this is good behavior or behavior that we should be celebrating. Again, it doesn't seem like this actually happened the way that Joshua is giving us, this picture. So
don't you think they said all this or wrote it on their on their stone reliefs and stuff to frighten other people, so they just lay down their arms and not fight?
Oh yeah, I think that they're
like the Assyrians are scary. I saw that they actually what do you call it? Piked people. Do you know what I mean? Like
impaled them.
Yes, like vampire. They cut off their.
That was a real punishment, I think.
No.
Yeah.
The Assyrians really did that. I mean, the Bible describes that they did it. They did it. You're right. I mean, did they do it to frighten people? Absolutely. Did they do it to show how powerful they were? Absolutely. I mean, it's the same reason why, people talk about, why. I mean, I hate to say it, but what's our modern equivalent? It's making war movies that glorify. It wasn't until we had a new wave of war movies that kind of didn't, no longer glorified war, that we went back to, kind of like, war is not a great thing, but up through the 60s, we were up to the 60s, we were still, kind of making war movies that made people, want to go off and fight and kill.
But we didn't brag about war crimes.
No, they're
not exactly, but the definition of a war crime shifts.
Well, and I'll just say that, you're right. There is a spectrum. There are things that, that we didn't glorify, but and there's always
Ask about Sherman's march through Georgia. You could get different opinions about that.
no, yeah, and there are examples, but I would say in our time, we have we the question of how we propagandize it, or how we whether we do certain things in battle in order to scare the enemy, but also what we do. I mean, Gail's point essentially is those records were, for the most part, actually for the people of Assyria to see, right? So they didn't care whether, they put those in Nineveh. They didn't put those out in the places that they conquered. Maybe they did in the places they conquered and they got taken away. But in Nineveh, then we know that they were there. And the purpose of them there is to make the people there feel like, oh, we're powerful. No one can beat us. Look what we do to our enemies. So that was propaganda to get people there to feel good. And then that's why it was in Nineveh, right? Because it's people from Nineveh killing people in other places. So that's, yeah. And again, you're right. We wouldn't do that. We thankfully we haven't done that very much in our country, but yeah, if you ask Native Americans about the history that they had, again, it's not something necessarily we bragged about in the same way, obviously, but there were definitely, there was a genocidal mindset to some of the campaigns that we were involved with against the Native Americans. So there are similarities, and when we read Joshua and we think about other types of wars that were fought against, whether it was an indigenous group or whether it was, it's interesting. I do want to say one thing about the Canaanites being indigenous. If we look at the Bible's account, the Canaanites come from Africa. They come from, they're descendants of Ham. So they're descendants of Africa. That's not what the DNA says. That isn't what the DNA says. The DNA says that they're, as I said, they're the same DNA that we have. Really indistinguishable. So the question is, where does that come from? And it's interesting because what we know about the Canaanites is that they were a vassal state of the they were vassals of the Egyptians. The Egyptians controlled Canaan during that period of Joshua, right up to that period. So to say that they're under Hamitic influence would have been correct from the standpoint of culture. Not necessarily, again, of ethnicity, of where the people came from, but from culture, they were definitely under an Egyptian sphere of influence. So for the Israelites to say, well, they're just Egyptian, isn't far removed from the standpoint of where maybe Israel felt that they were under the sphere of. If you look at what Israel's projection of where they want to be from, if you look at Abraham, who the Torah tells us is from Ur of Kasdim, which is the Chaldean capital. Ur is the city of the Chaldeans. He's from the east. He's from Babylonia. If you look at the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the kings of the east come against Abraham, bless you, and he's fighting with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah in those cities against the east, you can see that Israel sees this cultural influence of the east. And even though Abraham fights with the Canaanites, you get this impression that, again, he has a respect for those kings from the east, and also kind of there's a recognition that, yeah, he's here now, but those were his people. And so the Torah definitely leans towards the cultural influence from Babylonia, and Egypt is seen as a very powerful and as a advanced country. Don't get me wrong, but it's not our ways. Our ways are more like the Babylonian influence, and it could be that the Canaanites were seen as too Egyptian, whereas the cultural influences of the East were really what the Israelites were about. And I think that might be part of what's going on in the Bible, which is a look to that part of the world rather than that part. So rather than looking to the south and west, to look to the north and east, to the east part. So I think that there's a there's a cultural bias, if you will, in the Bible for that culture versus that culture. And it's a big issue, by the way. We don't talk about it a lot, but it's a big issue because it affected everything about your life. The Egyptians had a calendar and a way of life rotating around the sun. The Babylonians had a way of life rotated around the moon and a calendar based on that system. So these were big issues as far as, which cultural influences you were under sway of. And I think we don't recognize it so much in America because we really aren't caught between different cultures. But if you go to other places where there are cultural, there are linguistic and cultural and philosophical differences, whether it's a Catholic Protestant, differences, which exist in some parts, have existed for the last 500 years, or if you go to Canada, parts of Canada where the French and the English sides are kind of have had conflict. If you go to those places, there are people feel torn, and I think we don't think about it too much because again we're in a dominant culture. But if you go to Asia, for example, there's places in Asia where they really feel especially like in China today, where they feel torn because they feel in some cases that again, and we know about the Cultural Revolution, but right now in China there's some real debates on whether they're giving up their culture, their what's inherently Chinese, for example, to becoming more and more westernized. And it's a big issue in China. I mean, the current premier of China has recently been fighting against this impulse in the country to move to the West, and is cracking down on some of that. So we're not sensitive to it because we're not caught in the crosswinds of different cultures. But ancient Israel was always caught between different cultures, whether it was Africa, whether it was Egypt and Assyria or Babylonia, or whether it was between the Christians and Muslims, whether it was between and Jews oftentimes had to really choose kind of the lesser of two evils in some cases, but it's always been a case, and it is a case in the Middle East, by the way, today for people in the Arab world between what goes on in the West and Arabic culture as well. So again, we don't think about it, but a lot of people think about it, and we just don't have those discussions.
I think maybe not in the Reformed Jewish community, but I think at the greater American Jewish community, I think there's still some about how much assimilation should go on.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Rosemary. I mean, I don't know in the I would say in the Orthodox world, especially maybe I would say the ultra Orthodox are really the kind of the more of the Hasidic world today, which is not really fair to call it Hasidic, and it's not fair to call it ultra Orthodox. But yes, there is a segment of our community which probably represents maybe 10% of our community that is trying to figure out how to have those cultural influences of Jewish, of a Jewish philosophy and Jewish culture, which is interesting because, I mean, I'd argue that it's Eastern European culture as well, but I mean, the irony of
nobody in ancient Israel was wearing big furry hats.
But I'm not gonna. That sounds like I'm making it really sounded very judgmental. But
I'm sorry.
But no. I mean, for me, no. I mean, I started it.
You're right.
I mean, whatever. But I do mean from the fact that it is kind of ironic that when we talk about the cultural influences that people would say that they're protecting, many of those are not ancient Israelite practices. They are Eastern European practices, and it's just weird how that happens. But yes, we would say that as Rosemary points out, the clothing, the foods, a lot of what we're talking about here is not stuff you'll find in the Torah. But yes,
it also explains why they're always fighting the monotheistic idea that Baal is coming in all the time, the other gods are coming in all the time, that the people are slipping back because they have all this influence.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that you'll get in the Bible constantly, is that this is a theological issue. And in Joshua, it's very predominant, as we've already seen. You're going to see it even more in this next part, which is about, again, settling the land. So let's take a look at that. But again, keep in mind that's why this book is interesting for us, because there's a lot of resonance with living in a world, or kind of inheriting a world where there have been, we've had, look, when we hear people on the streets of America in the last couple of years saying Jews will not replace us, it sounds so strange, because this is like the furthest thing from our mind that we see ourselves as cultural, whatever influence, religious, ethnic influence on the country. I mean, we feel like we're such a minority. I mean, we are numerically such a minority. And so when we see these kinds of things, it's kind of strange, but the language itself is an interesting one, because again, it's about cultural influence, and it's about whether people feel, if they perceive, I mean, if they are been told that they're under attack culturally, then they pick that up, and it's very relevant. It's all I'm saying is it's very relevant to what we're living in today. If it's not warfare, if it's not actually kicking people out, which again, not sure that actually happened, the bottom line is it's cultural influence. So let's take a look at chapter 12. Here we go, Rosemary.
The following are the local kings whom the Israelites defeated and whose territories they took possession of. East of the Jordan, from the Wadi Arnon to Mount Hermon, including the eastern half of the Arabah, King Sihon of the Amorites, who resided in Heshbon and ruled over part of Gilead, from Aroer on the bank of the Wadi Arnon and the Wadi proper, up to the Wadi Yabok and the border of the Ammonites, and over the eastern Arabah up to the Sea of Kinneret, and southward by way of Beth Yeshimot at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah on the east, down to the Sea of the Arabah, that is, the Dead Sea. Also, the territory of King Og of Bashan, one of the last of the Rephaim, who resided in Ashtaroth and in Edrei, and ruled over Mount Hermon, Salcah, and all of Bashan up to the border of the Geshurites and the Maacathites, as also over part of Gilead down to the border of King Sihon of Heshbon.
Yeah. Now these are the ones we already read about in the book of Numbers. So these are the territories that were captured on the other side of the Jordan. And here's what we I guess we should read this next paragraph.
These were vanquished by Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the Israelites. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, assigned that territory as a possession to the Rubinites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh.
Yep. And so this is the area that is on the other side of the Jordan. We read about it all the time. It in a weird way, it wasn't part of the promised land. So in a weird way, this isn't part of the territory that Israel was supposed to get. So
this is east of the Jordan?
Yeah, this is so far what we've read is east of the Jordan, and it's not what we were supposed to have, which again kind of begs the question, like, well, if we weren't supposed to have it, why do we have it? And again, it's because these guys go to war against us. We get the territory. Let me just I'll pop it up there for you to see real quick what we're talking about. So again, it's this area right here, Manasseh, East Manasseh, if you will, as it says, Gad and Reuben. So these 2.5 tribes get land on the other side. There's the Jordan River. There's the Jordan, and right here. That's the Jordan River.
This really helps me because it's not just a bunch of places you're naming. I can see where they are.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, I want you to be able to see it. And again, this is the area of let me get that off now, but this area here that they got is a pretty substantial amount of land. If you see, I mean, you look at it compared to the other side, it's quite a lot. And again, is it promised land? Well, I guess it's not the promised land that was maybe originally supposed to be the promised land. So there, interestingly, we get a we get extra space before we even get in. So let's take a look at the places on the other side of the Jordan, as the Bible calls it, Be'ever HaYarden, which is on the other side of the Jordan, which is the way it's translated. I think they translate it as the west side of the Jordan, but we'd call it the side of the Jordan that Israel is on, if you will. So here we go.
And the following are the local kings whom Joshua and the Israelites defeated on the west side of the Jordan, from Baal Gad in the valley of the Lebanon to Mount Halak, which ascends to Seir, which Joshua assigned as a possession to the tribal divisions of Israel. In the hill country, in the lowlands, in the Arabah, in the slopes, in the wilderness, and in the Negev, in the land of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites.
Yep. Now we're going to have a list of kings coming up here that they defeated. Now, what's interesting about this, if you step back and just consider it for a second, when you get a list of kings, and they're all called Melech, everyone here is going to be called a Melech, as a king. Obviously, these are kings of cities. So these are city states. These are, not necessarily, in some cases, maybe 1,000 people, 500 people. They have a king, maybe 5,000 at the most. What's interesting about this is that tells you that the Canaanites were not a unified people, right? They don't have a king over all of their territory. So that kind of leads us to understand that probably whatever happened with the way the Israelites dealt with this transfer of existence from having Canaanite kings in the land and no longer having Canaanite kings in the land, it's not hard to imagine that you have a collapse of a lot of little city states rather than a big empire that somehow collapses and there's a big war. And we've read about some of these kings. We read about it already. They come together and they go to war against Joshua. But number one, it means they have to come together. It means that they're not together normally. And it kind of implies that there isn't a real stable situation here. And maybe sometimes these kings fought against each other. Not maybe. Logic tells us that these are probably kings that would oftentimes go to war against their neighboring kingdom. So again, there could have been a period of instability where, the Israelites or, non-city dwelling people kind of take advantage of the collapse of these city states as well. So we know right away from the Bible that these are not big. This is not an empire. This is not a state, if you will. So let's take a look at the list.
They were the king of Jericho, the king of Ai near Bethel, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Yarmouth, the king of Lachish.
Yeah, and each one of these actually is one. It says actually, it should.
Oh,
it should.
I couldn't tell whether the one was.
I know. I don't know why they did that. It is. They were, and again, you'll see. I mean,
I thought it was kind of a verse numbers.
Yeah, I know it's
It says Echad.
one. Yeah, one. There's one. Yeah.
Okay.
Gezer Echad. Yeah.
I'll do it. The king of Eglon, one. The king of Gezer, one. The king of Devir, one. The king of Geder, one. The king of Hormah, one. The king of Arad, one. The king of Libnah, one. The king of Makeda, one. The king of Bethel, one. The king of Tapua, one. The king of Hefer, one. The king of Aphek, one. The king of Sharon, one. The king of Madon, one. The king of Hazor, one. The king of Shimron Meron, 1. The king of Akshav, 1. The king of Taanach, 1. The king of Megiddo, 1. The king of Kadesh, 1. The king of Yokneam in the Carmel, 1. The king of Dor in the district of Dor, 1. The king of Goiim in the Gilgal, 1. The king of Tirzah, 1. Total number of kings, 31.
So again, it's unusual to have a list and then say, oh, here's one, here's one, here's one. And then obviously the purpose of this is to tell us that there was 31 kingdoms, king state, city states that he defeated. And again, is there a significance to 31? Probably, these are the biggest cities that existed in Canaan at the time. I would say this list is, these are all cities that we, Afek, Hatzor, Sharon, we have gone around Israel to excavate these cities, see if we can find something about the conquests of these cities. Literally, there's 31 of these cities. With the exception of about 3 or 4 of them, none of them seem to have fallen during this time that's described. Megiddo we know about because, again, it's the place of Armageddon. It's a place of many battles, which is why the Christian Bible perceived that maybe that would be where the final battle would be. Even at Megiddo, we don't see where we have lots of battles. It's the tell, right? That's where, again, it's the tell that was the inspiration for the book The Source by James Michener. That was Megiddo, because we have all these strata of destruction. We just don't see the type of replacement of people that the book of Joshua tells us. So these all are real cities. We haven't excavated all of them because we're not sure where all of them are. But we've excavated quite a few of them, and most of them don't tell a story of complete destruction during this time. So some of them do. I mean, like I said, Hatzor seems to have been destroyed during this time. Were there battles that happened between Israelites and Canaanites? Perhaps. I mean, or whatever we would call the Israelites at that period of time, tribes, people. I mean, look, the Bible itself describes us at this point as tribes people, which implies that we're not a settled people, that we don't have the kind of armaments that you'd expect for a people that were dwelling in a city. The perception that the Bible gives us is that we're a kind of a ragtag group of people that in this case are coming up from Egypt. But however we existed, the Bible sees these people as established city folk that we go to war against and essentially a kind of replace. So there is a weird idea here that the city people go down, and then we have the rise of these of the Israelite people. But what's interesting is it's not until 200 years later, until King David, where we have an organized situation, and we don't really know. And actually, when we get to the book of Judges, we'll see what was life like during this period of time when the Canaanite city-states come to an end, which, again, it may not have been as violent as the Bible says it was, but there does seem to be a shift in that. And again, we don't have definitive proof of King David, but we do have proof for the later kings of Judah and Israel. So it's not, we don't have it exactly yet. We have some little bits and pieces that's starting to come together. So we don't really have like 1000 BCE, but we do have like 800, 700 BCE. So we're close, but we can't quite go back there. And we definitely can't really go back to the 1200s when this took place. So we don't have we don't have material culture from this to say, hey, look, this is where Joshua lived and this is where these tribes lived. So just keep that in mind. We don't have that. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but we don't have it. So now as we turn to chapter 13, watch what happens here. And again, some people say it's a different author. Maybe it doesn't have to be. It's not really that important because there's a shift here from conquest to possession. And it happens here in chapter 13. So let's go.
Joshua was now old, advanced in years. The Lord said to him, "You have grown old, you are advanced in years, and very much of the land still remains to be taken possession of. This is the territory that remains, all the districts of the Philistines and all those of the Geshurites, from the Shihor, which is close to Egypt, to the territory of Ekron on the north, are accounted Canaanite, namely those of the 5 lords of the Philistines, the Gazites, the Ashdodites, the Ashkelonites, the Gittites, and the Ekronites, and those of the Avim on the south. Further, all the Canaanite country from Mearah of the Sidonians to Aphek at the Amorite border, and the land of the Gebalites with the whole valley of the Lebanon, from Baal Gad at the foot of Mount Hermon to Lebo Hamath on the east, with all the inhabitants of the hill country from the valley of the Lebanon to Misrepot Maim, namely all the Sidonians. I myself will dispossess those nations for the Israelites. You have only to apportion their lands by lot among Israel, as I have commanded you."
Yeah. And so Joshua essentially is told here by God, we got to finish this up. We haven't made this Israelite. We haven't, the job of displacing these people, which is the nice way of saying it, hasn't been completed. And we have a list now of all the places that are still not under Israelite control. Now, some of them are obvious, the Philistines, and they don't get displaced. In the book of Judges, the Philistines are our biggest enemy. They don't get replaced. And the territory that's described here, a good chunk of it, all the way up to the Lebanon, that is part of the promised land. That's in modern day Lebanon. But that area does not seem to have been, I would say, inhabited or controlled by the Israelites for any of the period of time before King David and Solomon, which it seems to be under the territory. Again, we don't have historical evidence for it because we don't have historical evidence for David and Solomon officially or completely. But we would see that these areas in the north and in the south are, I mean, at least the way the book of Joshua says, they're not Israelite yet. And what would make Sidon, or again, these places in Mount Hermon in the north, what would make these Canaanite? Well, we would call them today Phoenician, but there's no difference between Phoenician and Canaanite. Canaanites, the Phoenician were Canaanite people. They were Canaanite. They were, I mean, whatever you want to call them, that's the area that they lived, Phoenicia. But there was no difference between a Canaanite from Sidon as there was to a Canaanite that lived in Jerusalem, other than, again, there might have been, some slightly different diet, and cultural, little dialectic differences, but they were Canaanite people. They were Canaanite. And so when we talk about the Phoenicians, that's just another name for a northern Canaanite people, which, again, if you think about it, the Phoenicians were the ones who spread the alphabet around the entire Mediterranean. The reason that we have the language that we have, or the letters at least that we have, is because of the Phoenicians, because of the Canaanites. We don't think about that. We don't think about how important the Canaanite peoples were because we call them Phoenicians, and all of a sudden our mind goes, oh, they're Phoenician. But these people, the Phoenicians, were also, again, when you understand who they were the Carthaginians. These were the people who inhabited Carthage in northern Africa as a territory and and eventually as an empire that went to war against Rome. I mean, that's Hannibal. Hannibal was a Phoenician, therefore a Canaanite person, which means that he was as probably as genetically linked to the Jewish people as he was to anybody. They were not Israelites. I want to make it really clear. The Phoenicians and the Carthaginians had a whole different worship way. They practiced human sacrifice. They did all the things that the Bible says you're definitely not supposed to do, but they were ethnically Canaanite peoples. So think about that. And they spoke a language that was very similar to Hebrew, even into the Roman period. I mean, the name Hanubal is essentially the same name in Hebrew as Hanael or Yochanan. It means the grace of Baal, the grace of God. So when we think about Hannibal, Hanabal, it's the Chen of Baal. It's like the name Hanabal is a Canaanite Hebrew type name. I mean, people who spoke Hebrew could have conversed at that period of time with Canaanites perfectly. I mean, not perfectly. I mean, they would have had some dialectic differences, but they would have understood each other. So just keep that in mind. I mean, the language, the languages were very similar. A lot of the cultural, styles would have been similar. Same kind of diets. They might have eaten pork. They might have eaten certain animals that we didn't have, but they would have prepared them in similar ways. And I mean, we forget how big the Canaanite sphere of influence was. It went all the way to modern day Spain, all across North Africa, all across Asia Minor, and into parts of Greece, in parts of Italy that were settled by Carthaginians as well. So this was a big people. This is not a minor thing that the Israelites are fighting, or at least kicking out Canaanite culture out of their backyard. So here we go.
Therefore, divide this territory into hereditary portions for the 9 tribes and the half tribe of Manasseh. Now the Rubinites and the Gadites, along with the other half tribe, had already received the shares which Moses assigned to them on the east side of the Jordan, as assigned to them by Moses, the servant of the Lord. From the Aroer on the edge of the Wadi Arnon and the town in the middle of the Wadi, the entire tableland from Medeba to Dibon, embracing all the towns of King Sihon of the Amorites who had reigned in Heshbon, up to the border of the Ammonites. Further, Gilead, the territories of the Geshurites and the Maacathites, and all of Mount Hermon and the whole of Bashan up to Salcah. The entire kingdom of Og, who had reigned over Bashan and Ashtaroth and at Edrei, he was the last of the remaining Rephaim. These were defeated and dispossessed by Moses. But the Israelites failed to dispossess the Geshurites and the Maacathites, and Geshur and Maacath remain among Israel to this day.
So what does that tell us?
They didn't get everybody they thought they were going to get.
And the Bible tells us that. The Bible actually tells us that these people in inside Geshur is in the land of, on the Israelite side. It's on the Israel side. It's on the west side of the Jordan, that these people are within the they're within the territory. They were not taken out. And I will tell you that according to the Bible, the Geshurites are living there during the time of King David. So we don't know when it says until this day, we don't know what that day is, right? We're not sure when that was written, but I will tell you that the Bible tells us that they're living there during the time of King David. And why is this important? Why are the Geshurites in particular important? Well, for people who want to dig deep into the Bible, or who want a good trivia question, there is a princess of the Geshurites whose name is Maacah. And Maacah is, and it sounds like Maakoth, right? It's like the word Maakat. But Maacah is a Canaanite princess, and she's married to King David. And they have a son named Absalom. Absalom is half Geshurite. He's half Canaan. I mean, the Bible tells us that. It does not hide that fact. It does not obscure that fact. It is right there, right in the Bible, right in the book of Samuel. This is a Geshurite, part Geshurite guy. And when he gets into battle with his dad, when he's fighting his dad, and when his dad gets mad at him, and remember, Absalom was David's favorite son. It says that he goes and flees to his grandfather in Geshur. So this is actually important. Maybe that little line here is to remind us that Talmai, the king of the Geshurites, ends up protecting his grandson Absalom during that revolt, which of course is a failed revolt, ends up being a failed revolt. But when we talk about it, it's these little territories that were not taken over end up maybe becoming important later on. So that are the little Geshurites. All right.
No hereditary portion, however, was assigned to the tribe of Levi, their portion being a fire offerings of the Lord, the God of Israel, as he spoke concerning them. And so Moses assigned the following to the tribe of the Rubinites for their various clans, and it became theirs: the territory from Aroer on the edge of the Wadi Arnon, and the town in the middle of the Wadi up to Medeba, the entire tableland.
And again, when we're talking about the tableland, this is this kind of mesa, this flat area in between mountains, and this area is an area which includes parts of the east side of the Jordan River. That is a settlement area, an area that the Israelites didn't have originally, as I said, but this is all will be parts of Israel, now. So,
do we know the significance of the last of the Rephaim they keep talking about?
Well, the Rephaim are part of the Anakites. They're part of those. Let's put it this way. The easy answer is no. We don't understand what the significance of the Rephaim are, other than what we think, and what seems to be the case is that this is a confederation of Canaanite kings that were known to be powerful at some point in time. My guess is that it's probably hundreds and hundreds of years in the past, which doesn't really, it was consistent with what we just said, because when they talk about him, it seems like it's not a present issue for them. Then when they said the last of the Rephaim, seems to be, oh, well, the rest of the Rephaim are long gone. So it seems to be like this like confederation of powerful kings that were inhabiting the land of Canaan for a period of time. And so we don't understand the full context of it, because we have the references to it, and every reference is that they're powerful and that they were strong, but we don't know. They knew what the people who wrote that knew what it meant, and we don't really know the significance of what that was. We don't have archaeological evidence for it, but we do have archaeological evidence for these places, and the Geshurites are still mentioned in Assyrian texts from the 800s. So when the Assyrians went to war against the north, there were still places that were not under Judean control or Israelite control that were Canaanite. That's why I said, you can't dismiss what's in the Bible and say, well, it's just a made up imagination. It's not. It's actually, you could also argue that in the places where the Bible says we didn't conquer that, believe it. when it says that we didn't conquer it, they're probably really telling you because it was an embarrassment. I mean, it's essentially an embarrassment. They're not saying, hey, we didn't conquer it because we didn't want to. They're saying we didn't conquer it. And maybe, again, they just said it's just not worth the fight, whatever they're paying us a tribute, whatever it was. They're not bragging about it. They're not saying it because we want to put them on the list of the 31. They didn't. So keep that in mind, that it's not take that for pretty good evidence. And again, we have Assyrian records that say the Geshurites, they conquered the Geshurites. The Geshurites were no match for the Assyrians. Yeah. All right.
Yahaz, Kedemot, Mepaath, Kiryat Haim, Sibma, and Zereth Shahar in the hill of the valley, Beth Peor, the slopes of Pisgah and Beth Yeshimot, all the towns of the tableland, and the entire kingdom of Sihon. The king of the Amorites who had reigned in Heshbon, for Moses defeated him, and the Midianite chiefs, Avi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reva, who had dwelt in the land as princes of Sihon. Together with the others that they slew, the Israelites put Balaam, son of Beor, the augur, to the sword.
Yeah, and so we read about that in Numbers, the story of Balaam. He was the one who cursed us, was going to curse us. He ended up blessing us, but here we
got killed anyway.
Here we have again a brag that we killed him, specifically with the sword, and he's called here Kosem, which is another word for a sorcerer, or you decided to use the word augur for this, but yeah, he's called lots of different things, wizard, but a Kosem is a specific type of word for them. It's not a witch. It's not a necromancer. That's the word I'm looking for. One who consults with the dead. An augur is more somebody who looks at, tea leaves and, more likely innards of an animal to see what's going on with the future. And they killed him. So this was all on the other side of the Jordan. Yeah.
Didn't at one point we talk about, and this may be like 10 years ago, that there were multiple Balaam people? Like each generation had one that used that name? Am I dreaming that?
No, it's possible that there was more than one Balaam, but when we read the words Balaam, the son of Beor, that's the dude. And it's not, his name is not Baal. It's not the Baal. It's not Baalam. It's Balaam. This guy in particular was the dude that they saw as a threat because he had power. As we mentioned when we've studied Balaam in the past, the interesting thing about Balaam is he was really well known in the Middle East, in the sense that the oldest record we have of anybody who's mentioned by name in the Bible is a text that we found in the area of this place we're talking about, Aurora, in this area right here in Jordan. In about 50 years ago, we found it, 60 years ago, we found a text that is, we call the Balaam text. We found it in a cave that had collapsed. It's literally 2,800 years old, that refers to Balaam, this same Balaam, son of Beor, who's an augur, who's a wizard, who's powerful. He's seen as a guy of great wisdom and power. And so the Bible picks up a story about a guy who was well known in the air at the time, around that time. So here he's mentioned more from the standpoint of Joshua, that we simply killed him. So it's more of a brag that we killed, that we're the ones who killed Balaam. So this powerful wizard, we killed him. And here it's just used as a brag. It doesn't even talk about what he did, the cursing. And then there's also the tradition that he led the people in the Bible. We read about the Midianites leading us into, this sexual or this orgy and this escapade at Beth Peor, where we actually kill, where Moses and Joshua and the followers kill the people who were engaging in that worship, and Balaam is killed at that moment. because he's responsible. He's seen as being responsible for finally getting to the Israelites. And how did he do it? He did it through sex. He did it through using, finding the weakness of, and exploiting it. And he did find a way to finally get us. So here it doesn't refer to that. It doesn't refer to any of that backstory. It simply says we killed him. And it was part of our campaign. So they're definitely spending a lot of time on the other side of the Jordan River here. But that's the first place that we conquered. So we will get back to the other side of the Jordan, I promise, to the side that is Israel today in the next chapter. Okay.
The boundary of the Rubinites was the edge of the Jordan. That was the portion of the Rubinites for their various clans, those towns with their villages. To the tribe of Gad, for the various Gadite clans, Moses assigned the following, and it became their territory. Yazir, all the towns of Gilead, part of the country of the Ammonites, up to the Aroer, which is close to Rabbah, and from Heshbon to the Ramat Mizpeh and Betanim, and from Mahanaim to the border of Libir. And in the valley, Beth Haram, Beth Nimrah, Sukkot, and Zephon, the rest of the kingdom of Sihon, the king of Heshbon, down to the edge of the Jordan and up to the tip of the Sea of Kinneret on the east side of the Jordan. That was the portion of the Gadites for their various clans, those towns with their villages.
Yep. And so this is now what cities, what villages each of the tribes get to have. And so this is the apportionment. This is, okay, this is what was conquered, and this is where the people were settled. So first we have the Gadites. The Gadites, again, on the other side of the Jordan River. So this is if you want, this is actually where the shift actually happens. So we're kind of reminded about the Rubinites, the Gadites, the half tribe of Manasseh, and then the Gadites get their piece. Now we have let me just check. Yeah, the Rubinites actually come first. It's a very short line. The boundary of the Rubinites, it just says the edge of the Jordan. That's it. It's not actually, those cities aren't actually named. The Gadites are mentioned, the cities. And then here we have the Manassites, the half tribe, the half of the tribe of Manasseh. It's not a half tribe. It's half of the tribe of Manasseh gets these areas on the other side of the Jordan. Here they go.
And to the half tribe of Manasseh, Moses assigned the following so that it went to the half tribe of Manasseh for its various clans and became their territory. Mahanaim, all of the Bashan, the entire kingdom of Og, king of Bashan, and all of Havot Yair in Bashan, 60 towns, and part of Gilead and Ashtaroth and Edrei, the royal cities of Og and Bashan, were assigned to the descendants of Machir, son of Manasseh, to a part of the descendants of Machir for their various clans. Those then were the portions that Moses assigned in the steppes of Moab on the east side of the Jordan. But no portion was assigned by Moses to the tribe of Levi, the Lord of the God of Israel as their portion, as he spoke concerning them.
Yeah, so we get the Manassites, that they get the kind of the northern part of that east side. So that goes kind of Manasseh, Reuben, and then God below. And the Gadites and the Reuben and the Manassites get a much more description of which cities they get. They seem like they get much better or much more territory. They're assumedly larger, tribes numerically, but they also seem to get cities. They get these cities that are named off, which were probably, again, that means they're already fortified, they're already developed, there's some type of infrastructure in those places. So that's a great thing to have, right? To be able to have those cities. Remember, if you're living outside of, if you have territory and then there's people like the Geshurites that are living in a city, assumedly you either have another city nearby or you're living outside of a city wall and they get to live inside the city wall. So there's a little bit of an advantage to those people. So
are we doing much archaeology there? I mean, considering it's at war.
What was that?
are we doing much archaeology there considering it's at war?
Well, Jordan,
You know, like,
no, Jordan,
yeah.
well, Jordan's fairly stable. So there is archaeology that goes on in Jordan. I will tell you that it is an interesting thing politically, in that Jordan is not really interested in Israelite. They're not interested in Jewish history in Jordan. Okay. I will tell you that there is definitely politically a problem from the standpoint of Jordan and Israel have had relations now for 30 years, almost 30 years. It's not a great friendship from the standpoint of there's not a lot of interaction between the people. There's not a lot of travel going back and forth between them, other than Israelis and American and foreign tourists going from Israel into Petra. There's not a lot of development of the archaeological sites in Jordan. Jordan is a very, very fragile country. And it is, I actually just made the news in the last
one of their ex-kings, was it?
No, it's King Abdullah. It's the current.
Oh, their current king. Okay,
Yeah.
Stashed a lot of money in foreign accounts.
Yes. Somebody, I think it was Colbert or somebody made fun of him because the thing that is the thing about Abdullah is that well, first of all, that's a country that we've been propping up. Jordan, we've been propping up since the days of King Hussein, his father. But the thing about, and I forget how Colbert said it, but yeah, the thing about Abdullah that everybody makes fun of is that he's married to like one of the most beautiful women in the world. And that's not a joke. I mean, she is, just show you Queen Rania for a second. They make a joke about it because I mean, again, what is objective, it's a subjective question. I mean, you can't say that, but they'll make jokes about the fact that, what's he known for is essentially he's married to this beautiful woman that, so here, I'll just show you a picture of they just literally always call her the beautiful Queen Rania, the sparkling queen. She looks very westernized, but and I wouldn't say they love her they don't love her necessarily in Jordan, but there's the beautiful Queen Rania. The country's been propped up by the United States for decades, and it's survived the Arab Spring because there's no real political alternative to the king. But it is a fragile situation. The reality about Jordan that a lot of people don't talk about is that it's 70% Palestinian. So the beautiful Queen Rania that you just saw is she's Palestinian. She was born in 1970 in Kuwait to Palestinian parents. So, King Abdullah, like his father Hussein, was from a Arabian Hashim. It's called the Hashemite dynasty. They were not native to Jordan, and they were essentially established by the British, and then we kind of inherited these people as the monarchs for the country. It's a fragile situation, and nobody knows how long it'll be able to hold itself together. But Israel has a relationship, has a peace treaty, but it doesn't really do much. So get back to your question. Jordan isn't really interested in establishing the history of the Jewish people in that country, which would be the situation. The bottom line is if Israel didn't exist, if Israel was not under Jewish control today, no one would be spending money and time in Israel uncovering Jewish history, right? We wouldn't have an Israel Antiquities Authority that was going around excavating and giving permission for groups to come there. Look, what happens in America, in Israel today, is that primarily American colleges, and primarily Christian American colleges, send over students to excavate places that are mentioned in the Bible. Because for most evangelical Christians, establishing a Jewish presence in the land of Israel biblically is part of their belief. It fits very nicely into their belief. And so that's what happens today. If in an alternate universe, Israel didn't exist, who would be excavating these places? I'm not making any arguments on whether it should be. I mean, obviously, I like history, so I'd like this to be done, but it wouldn't be done. I mean, nobody would be spending time excavating a place like Hatzor or a place like Jerusalem if there wasn't a desire for people to uncover and to explore their history. I will tell you, for the most part, I mean, not even for the most part, the Israel Antiquities Authority and the people who control the Israel excavations for the Israeli government are not looking to prove the Bible. I will tell you that they're just as they want to get the truth, and they really aren't bent on proving that something in the Bible happened exactly the way the Bible said it. It's just not the case. When stuff happens and it proves that there's a kernel of truth to the Bible, obviously people like that, but that's different than they're out there trying to prove the historicity of the Bible or to use the Bible to establish Jewish control. A lot of people in the Israel Antiquities Authority are on the left of the spectrum, political spectrum, and they're not looking to cooperate with religious authorities. And as a matter of fact, in some cases, the religious parties and the religious groups don't like what they're doing because in some cases they're disturbing tombs and they're disturbing burial sites for Jews, or maybe for Jews, which even if it might be for Jews, the religious groups, the rabbinic authorities are not happy with. So just understand, these are not people walking around with the Bible trying to prove that the Bible happened. It's not the case. On the other hand, this would not be done if Israel couldn't be done if Israel wasn't in control of these places. Look, I have to tell you, and again, I don't think any people should be displaced in order for it to happen. We would like to see whatever final status there is for any parts of the West Bank. We would hope that Israel would still be able to excavate in those areas and uncover the past. Now, you can't destroy someone's future in order to uncover the past. But look, I got news for you. There are places in America there are building projects that have been shut down because they're built on burial grounds or on some historical site. So, we understand that it's important to excavate and to establish our history. And I would say, look, how could you say in America, or specifically in Southern California, if you're excavating, you have to hire an archaeological team to excavate the area first before you can come in and do any type of work on a brand new facility, a brand new area. So I'm in favor of that. I mean, I don't want to destroy someone's history, and obliterate someone's history in order to build something. So you could make the same claim, in the land of Israel. I can only tell you that that's what's happening. As of today, that's what's happening. Will it always be that way? I don't know. But as of right now, for the last 72 years of Israel's history, Israel has not gone around trying to prove Israel's existence by the excavations. And if the truth says, hey, Joshua never conquered this area, then no one's saying, hey, let's find something that proves our case. It's not the case. So, all right, let's take a look at chapter 14.
And these are the allotments of the Israelites in the land of Canaan that were apportioned to them by the priest Eleazar, by Joshua son of Nun, and by the heads of the ancestral houses of the Israelite tribes, the portions that fell to them by lot, as the Lord had commanded through Moses for the 9.5 tribes.
So this is everything on the west side in the modern nation of Israel, not in the land of Jordan. Yeah.
For the portion of the other 2.5 tribes had been assigned to them by Moses on the other side of the Jordan. He had not assigned any portion among them to the Levites. For whereas the descendants of Joseph constituted two tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, the Levites were assigned no share in the land, but only some towns to live in, with the pastures for their livestock and cattle. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses, so the Israelites did when they apportioned the land. The Judites approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Canaanite, said to him, "You know what instructions the Lord gave at Kadesh Barnea to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I gave him a forthright report, while my companions who went up with me took the heart out of the people. I was loyal to the Lord, my God."
Yes. And so this is a recounting of the story of the spies from the book of Numbers. And so according to this, Joshua was 40 years old when he went out to spy the land. So that means you don't have to be super good at math to know that 40 years later, he'd be about 80. So that's about how old he is now. And he's recounting what happens the last time they were supposed to be apportioning out the land 40 years ago, when he was 40. What happens here with this? So they really have a shift back to, well, let's remind people, and we had that with the Sihon and Og. We have remnants and going back to the book, to the past, to the book of Numbers. But here you really have this interesting, not just about the conquests, but about this really bad time in Jewish history where they didn't have the confidence to do it. So what does he say? The way Joshua says it, my companions took the heart out of the people, which is really a powerful description of what happens. Of course, I was loyal to God, but that's the way that's Joshua's vantage point of what happened at that point, where he did the right thing. Everyone else except for Caleb Joshua and Caleb do the right thing, which, by the way, if you notice, it says Caleb here, right? But it doesn't, doesn't say it here, but doesn't mention Caleb here, but it mentioned him there. And it kind of doesn't emphasize him as much as maybe he should have been, but this is Joshua talking about it. So I don't know. All right, here we go.
On that day, Moses promised on oath, "The land on which your foot trod shall be a portion for you and your descendants forever, because you were loyal to the Lord my God." Now the Lord has preserved me, as he promised. It is 45 years since the Lord made this promise to Moses, when Israel was journeying through the wilderness. And here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as on the day that Moses sent me. My strength is the same now as it was then, for battle and for activity. Yeah, right.
I am strong today. Well, but this is the same kind of talk that we have about Moses, right? That he's still strong
Right.
and full of vigor when he dies. So
No, but he's saying it himself, which makes me skeptical.
correct. Well, somebody said that Joshua said that. So
Right.
he is he's ready to go. So again, according to this, it's about, if you do the math, it's about 5 years later from when they first crossed over. So it's taken about 5 years, according to this. Well, it's hard to imagine that it's taken 5 years for them to go through Canaan so far, but maybe look at it as he's kind of explaining what's happened.
And then besides, God just told him he was getting old.
Yeah. Yeah. So look, there does seem to be, I don't like to talk about it a lot, but there does seem to be a shift of authorship right about here. right about here.
So you think there's a different author there?
Yeah, it starts off in about chapter 14. And it kind of is given away by the fact that we go back to this the way that this is described here. And again, it could be, well, you're just summarizing it again, but we just went through this. We just went through the 2.5 and the 9. I mean, we just had this description of the 9.5. I mean, the 2.5. So it does seem a little weird, but again, it there's a reason why it's here, and that it's here. All right. So here we go.
I am still as strong today as okay. So assign to me this hill country as the Lord promised on that day. Though you too heard on that day that Anakites are there in great fortified cities. If only the Lord is with me, I will dispossess them as the Lord promised. So Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and assigned Hebron to him as his portion. Thus Hebron became the portion of Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, as it still is, because he was loyal to the Lord, the God of Israel. The name of Hebron was formerly Kiryat Arba. Arba was the great man among the Anakites, and the land had rest from war.
Yeah, and so here we have the Anakites, the Rephaim again, that are mentioned here. These cities that are, inhabited by powerful Canaanite kings, if you will. And here you get Caleb. He gets Hebron. Now again, he is mentioned, and so it's not like they obscured him or said it wasn't there. But it's interesting that it's kind of like, it doesn't say that he's there with Joshua. Doesn't say he's there with him, as the only other person. But it does say right here he was loyal to the God of Israel, and so he gets that area. And so he's recognized. It's kind of like he's the other good guy from that time, and he doesn't really seem to have it's not mentioned that he had anything to do with the conquest. He's not mentioned until this chapter. But again, maybe it's because somebody wanted us to know that don't forget about Caleb. And so, he kind of gets reinserted back into the story because this is maybe, again, an author from Judah who wants us not to forget Caleb. Again, he's not mentioned at all in the first 13 chapters. So again, it's not there. It's not, we don't know what to make of that other than it's not there. But here we have Caleb getting his territory. So we're going to read a little bit more. Hopefully we'll get through chapter 15 as we go now into the tribe of Judah.
The portion that fell by lot to the various clans of the tribe of Judah lay farthest south down to the border of Edom, which is the wilderness of Zin. Their southern boundary.
This is Judah. I mean, this right here, Caleb is from the tribe of Judah, as it says. And of course, it calls him here the Kenizzite, which is a part of the tribe of Judah, but he gets Hebron, which is in the south. It does seem like, again, why is that line there? And the land had rest from war. We can kind of come up with other possibilities, but it does seem like kind of out of place a little bit when we're in the midst of doing an apportionment. But anyways, here we go. Here's back to apportionment.
The portion that fell by lot to the various clans of the tribe of Judah lay farthest south down to the border of Edom, which is the wilderness of Zin. Their southern boundary began from the tip of the Dead Sea, from the tongue that projects southward. it proceeded to the south of the ascent of the Akravim, passed on to Zin, ascended to the south of Kadesh Barnea, passed on to Hezron, ascended to Adar, and made a turn to Karka. From there, it passed on to Azmon and proceeded to the Wadi of Egypt, and the boundary ran onto the sea. That shall be your southern boundary.
And this is the southern boundary of all of the Israelites, the tribe of Judah.
The boundary on the east was the Dead Sea up to the mouth of the Jordan. On the northern side, the boundary began at the tongue of the sea at the mouth of the Jordan. The boundary ascended to Beth Haglah and passed north of Beth Arabah. Then the boundary ascended to the stone of Bohan, son of Reuben. The boundary ascended from the valley of Achor to Devir and turned north to Gilgal, facing the ascent of Adumim, which is south of the Wadi. From there, the boundary continued to the waters of En Shemesh and ran on to En Rogel. Then the boundary ascended to the valley of Ben Hinnom along the southern flank of the Jebusites, that is, Jerusalem. The boundary then ran up to the top of the hill which flanks the valley of Hinnom on the west, at the northern end of the valley of Rephaim. From the hilltop, the boundary curved to the fountain of the waters of Nephtoah and ran on to the towns of Mount Ephron. Then the boundary curved to Baalah, that is, Kiryat Yearim. From Baalah, the boundary turned westward to Mount Seir, passed north of the slope of Mount Yearim, that is, Chesalon, descended to Beth Shemesh, and passed on to Timnah. The boundary then proceeded to the northern flank of Ekron. The boundary curved to Shekaron, passed on to Mount Baalah, and proceeded to Yavniel, and the boundary ran on to the sea. And the western boundary was the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. Those were the boundaries of the various clans of the Judites on all sides. In accordance with the Lord's command to Joshua, Caleb, son of Jephunneh, was given a portion among the Judites, namely Kiryat Arba, that is, Hebron. Abba was the father of Anak. Caleb dislodged from there the three Anakites, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, descendants of Anak. From there, he marched against the inhabitants of Devir. The name of Devir was formerly Kiryat Sephir, and Caleb announced, I will give my daughter Aksah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiryat Sephir. His kinsman, Othniel, the Kenitzite, captured it, and Caleb gave him his daughter Aksah in marriage. When she came to him, she induced him to ask her father for some property. She dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb asked her, what is the matter? She replied, give me a present, for you have given me away as Negev land, so give me springs of water. And he gave her upper and lower Galot. This was the portion of the tribe of the Judites by their clans. The towns at the far end of the tribe of Judah near the border of Edom in the Negev were Kabziel, Adair, Yagur, Kina, Dimonah, Adada, Kadesh, Hazor, Ithnan, Ziph, Telem, Bealot, Hazor Hadath, Kiriot Hezron, that is Hazor, Amam, Shema, Moladah, Hazar Gadah, Heshmon, Beth Pelet, Hazar Shual, Beersheba, Biziohia, Baalah, Eim, Ezem, El-Talad, Chashil, Hormah, Ziklag, Madmanah, Sansana, Lebaot, Shihim, Ain, and Rimon. Total 29 towns with their villages.
Very good, but you're not done.
In the lowland, Eshtaol, Zorah, Ashna, Zanoah, En-Ganim, Tapua, Anam, Yarmut, Adulam, Sukkot, Azekah, Sha'arim, Aditaim, Gedarah, and Gederotaim. 14 towns with their villages. Zenan, Hadashah, Migdal Gad, Dilan, Mispeh, Yoktiel, Lachish, Bozkath, Eglon, Kabon, Lamas, Keithlish, Gederot, Beth Dagon, Naamah, and Makkedah, 16 towns with their villages. But wait, there's more.
Yep.
Livnah, Eser, Ashan, Iftah, Ashna, Nazib, Keilah, Aksib, and Ma'areshah, 9 towns with their villages. Ekron with its dependencies and villages. From Ekron westward, all the towns in the vicinity of Ashdod with their villages. Ashdod, its dependencies and its villages. Gaza, its dependencies and its villages, all the way to the Wadi of Egypt and the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. And in the hill country, Shamir, Yatir, Sukkot, Danah, Kiryat Sanah, that is Devir, Anav, Eshtemo, Anim, Goshen, Holon, and Gilo, 11 towns with their villages. Arab, Duma, Eshan, Yanum, Beth Tapua, Athakah, Humtah, Kiryat Arba, that is Hebron, and Zior, 9 towns with their villages. Maon, Carmel, Ziph, Yatah, Yisrael, Yokdeam, Zanoah, Cain, Gibeah, and Timnah, 10 towns with their villages. Halhul, Bethsur, Gedor, Ma'arat, Beth Anot, and El Tekon, 6 towns with their villages. Kiryat Baal, that is Kiryat Yarim, and Rabbah, 2 towns with their villages. In the wilderness, Beth Arabah, Medin, Sekakah, Nibshan, Irmelah, and En-Gedi, 6 towns with their villages.
Done.
But the Judites could not dispossess the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so the Judites dwell with the Jebusites in Jerusalem to this day.
Yeah. So you just read, and I think there's 60 something chapters in that. Here, let me see. I can't see it over there. Yeah, it's 60 some chapters, 67 verses in that chapter. Look, this is the tribe of Judah as it's described, and I'm going to show you right now so that you can see this. I got to close down that little thing there. Too much going on my screen right now. Here we go. I'm going to try to make this picture bigger so you can see it. Let's see. Here we go. So this is the area that's described in this chapter 15. So not all these cities are not all the cities that are named are here. We're not even sure where all of them are. Sometimes you'll see a question mark where some of these are. Some of them we know. Obviously, some of them were pretty big. The Bible just told us that we never captured Jerusalem. That's pretty significant. We didn't capture Jerusalem. Now, again, this is also partly in the tribe of Benjamin, so it's also relying on them to do it. But it basically says the Jebusites are living in Jerusalem, which is true. According to the Bible, we never defeated the Jebusites. Jerusalem was never attacked by the Israelites. The Jebusites eventually surrender and allow the Israelites to kind of settle in the city and make it their capital, but they're never wiped out. That means there's Jebusite population in Jerusalem during the time of King David and King Solomon. They don't make it free of Jebusite people. But that's not what I want to focus on before we wrap up. I want to focus on something that you just saw, which again, look, the rabbis 2,000 years ago knew that there was a problem here. In here, you got Joshua blesses Caleb. Look at here. Joshua blesses Caleb and assigned Hebron to his portion. Yes, Hebron became a portion of Caleb. Now, if that's the only version of the story we just had, it seems like, Caleb is a loyal friend or whatever, a sidekick to Joshua, and he gets some territory. It's, it's what we have in that chapter. The land has rest from war. That's not what Rosemary just read. Rosemary just read that Caleb ran a campaign against the people. I mean, when we get into this, Caleb dislodged from there the Anakites, Sheshai. I mean, and by the way, one of the guys, his name is Talmai, which is that other name that we had, Gesherite king, Canaanite name. I mean, this is a totally different version of Caleb than we had earlier. Not like a passive guy that just, is along for the ride at this point. I mean, assumedly he's also in his 80s by this point, but that's not what happens here. I mean, this is a guy who goes into battle, says he's going to give his daughter in marriage to the guy who captures the town, which is, not necessarily the way you're supposed to hand your daughter over to marriage. It sounds like some kind of Greek myth or, some kind of fairy tale. Though, interestingly, it doesn't sound like it was made up. It doesn't sound like this is a fairy tale. Because first of all, it tells us specifically who she marries, who he's married, who he marries her off to, which is one of his kinsmen, right? Somebody from the same clan, Othniel. But the other thing that's really powerful about it is she comes to her dad and says, "What,
where's my dowry?
You gave me away as a present, you gave me away, give me a present back, there seems to be a bit of a kernel of a story of, a woman coming back to her dad going, come on, really? You gotta, you can't send me off, as a gift and then not help, our town that you've now done. So it's a kind of a little kind of ideology of a town that ends up getting some springs because the woman says, no, this isn't right. And so, this area of Gulot gets transferred over to the town. Now, again, these are important allotments because they're going to tell people which parts of which tribe get which thing, and which, not just which tribes, but which parts of which tribes get which places, and which cities control which areas. So in some cases, the city gets, oh, well, that part's really part of that city. I mean, we had a reference to Chatzor really controls this part of Chatzor that's, in the suburbs, if you will. So this issue of who controls what it's a major issue, right? It's a major issue even in our own day. We have parts of Santa Clarita that are controlled by the county, like where I'm living right now, which are not part of the city. And, who, trying to annex places, that still goes on in our own day. The economic value of certain parts of some places, and what resources, they're there, water being important resources in those days too. So, these are important issues. And so Joshua essentially establishes the right for, territorial rights for who gets what. So that, if people go back and say, well, I think this is our land, you go, no, book of Joshua says that's for them. That's Caleb's, that's his territory. The going back to Caleb, he gave Gulot to his daughter when she gets Kiryat Sefer, that's their territory. So these are important stories for tribal rights, for who gets what. I will tell you that the thing that just sticks out in my mind is you have these two versions of a story that are very different, in the sense that one, you see Caleb as an active, part of this campaign. And then this other one where Joshua basically says, just, this is yours. You're a good guy. Here, take that. which again is a completely different version of it. So, look, the easy answer and the simple answer is it's written by a different author. The rabbis traditionally couldn't say that. So they have a little bit of a challenge for, how do you include two versions of the story? How do you justify there being conflicting versions of a story? It's a little bit harder, in my mind, to be able to understand that and rectify that from that standpoint of the tradition that Joshua wrote this whole thing. Seems to me like somebody who was from the tribe of Judah wrote this part that we're reading right now and wants you to know very well that Caleb was actively part of this campaign. And I don't know. It's a cool story too, this two lines, she comes to her father, gets off the donkey and says, and he says to her, what's the matter? So it's a little tiny, it's a little tiny
vignette.
Yeah, it's a vignette of a daughter demanding her right. And I mean, it's kind of funny because
it just shows she's living far enough away that she has to use a donkey to come and see her dad.
Yeah, so she's got the way she says it too. You gave me away as Negev land, which is almost like saying, the Negev is mostly desert. I mean, and even back then, let's say it wasn't as deserty as it is today. She's still saying you kind of gave me away for trash land. So, I think about people who have land like, out in Kern County, out in somewhere in the middle of the California city, and you go, I got land out here, I'll give it to you. And you're like, no, I don't want your land. Give me water, let me at least have a life. So I think the story is kind of funny because they are in the Negev. I mean, the Judites control the Negev, and she kind of disparages the Negev when she says that to her dad. You've given me away like Negev land. So yeah, I think it's funny because it's their land, by the way. So again, the tribe of Judah is very important. It's going to be the kingdom of Judah during the time. I mean, King David essentially makes Judah a separate kingdom during King Saul's time. Remember, he revolts against Saul and makes Judah a territory, a kingdom on its own. And later on, Solomon rules a united kingdom, but even during his lifetime, it's split off, in the northern part under Jeroboam revolts. During the time of King Solomon, that revolt is already underway. So keep in mind that the idea of a unified kingdom of Israel doesn't last beyond really. I mean, King David is the only one who's able to unify the territories. And even by the time of his son, King Solomon, it's already fallen apart. So did not last long. It was maybe too much to try to keep together. So the idea that Joshua, was kind of the unifying force behind this, even in Joshua, you start to see, well, is there another narrative here? The narrative of the tribe and then the kingdom of Judah. So just remember that that's in the back of this the whole time, was how unified are the Israelites? How tough was it to keep them all together? So that's something we're going to see in the book of Judges, and in the book of Samuel. We're going to see it, and just keep it in mind, in the back of your mind. This myth that there was a unified kingdom is that, I mean, it's a myth. It's not. It doesn't really ever exist. So it is. It's important to see it even in the development in the book of Joshua, and that the tribes had their own. They had their own narratives. They had their own stuff. So next week we're going to read about the tribes of Joseph, specifically Ephraim, and then the rest of the tribe of Manasseh. That is also kind of the heartland of Israel. This is the part of we said today is known as the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, these two chunks are actually the least Jewish parts of Israel today. Again, it's also Palestinian land, territory, whatever you want to call it. This is the area that we're going to read about next time, is also much of the parts of Judah are in the Negev are part of Israel, but the area around Hebron, this part that Caleb gets, Hebron is deeply contested, to put it mildly. There are a couple thousand Jews that live in Hebron, surrounded by 100,000 Palestinians in Hebron. So that's the part that we're reading about right now. Geographically, again, we looked at the overlay of what one town looks like today when I showed you what Gibeon looks like. Same thing could be said for Hebron and the places that we're going to read about next week, like Bethel, so and Luz, and some of these places that we read about. So everybody, please stay healthy, stay safe. We're gonna hopefully see you at Pet Service or tomorrow night for Genesis, where we're reading Genesis on Wednesday nights.
I thought there was no class tomorrow night, according to.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, there's no.
I wonder why, though, Rabbi. Why isn't there a class?
There's no class. It's been preempted by the weather. It's been it's been preempted by wild card day. I'll be honest. If the Dodgers lose, there's no more playoffs. So what can I tell you? I mean, it's there's no way I can focus on class that night if in the background that game is going on. So
but there's not going to be a problem because the Dodgers are going to win by the second inning.
That would be wonderful, Mike. My favorite Dodger, Muncy, is now out. So
I know. Did you see that? What happened?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't see it live, but I saw it.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's sad because he's a great hard.
How much do you want to bet if the Dodgers play Milwaukee in the playoffs that guy gets hit?
It wasn't. Yeah, you're right.
It was his fault the way he ran.
You're right.
He was out. He was interference.
He's probably going to get hit. You're right.
Yep.
Well, let's see. Let's hope it doesn't happen. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But anyways, again, we will hopefully see you guys soon. And again, the E-Blast has a lot of good stuff in it. There's a lot
3 weeks, 3 Fridays in a row.
Yep. The 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th. So
that's great.
Coming back a little bit more in person. So
what, 2 weeks in 2 weeks in November too?
Yeah. So hopefully everybody will stay safe and we'll continue to see the diminishing of death. And let's just pray for that. I have the numbers are getting better, as you heard, but it's still happening. I mean, I have a funeral on Sunday for a 40-year-old woman who died of COVID while she gave birth. So this is still, we're not out of the woods yet, folks. And she couldn't get vaccinated because she was pregnant, and she died giving birth. She was a nurse. So yeah, we're not done, but the numbers are getting better, and we seem to be on these 2-month cycles.
I thought the vaccine was safe for pregnant women.
That's what I read too.
They only started saying that they didn't recommend it for pregnant women. So that's why she didn't have it at that stage. And again, later on, I mean, she's a nurse, so and she was very in favor of vaccinations, but it wasn't, I guess maybe there was a complication or something. So the point is that her baby was born 6 days ago and she died as she gave birth. So, and yeah, this is real, folks. So again, keep safe, keep healthy, everybody. It's good seeing you all today.